person is essentially the quintessential researcher, the person for whom we've given some responsibility to dig deeper into the subject matter. And of course, the subject matter in this case is rather unique. I think this is the only docudrama play that's ever been, well, I take it back. Brecht wrote one, and since then, only a couple, and Brecht's play in this one could not be any more different. So I've asked Christian, who I knew going in was a very big fan of Galileo and had done quite a bit of research about it, just to provide us with some information. Information that's not meant to compete with recess or lunch, Oliver, but rather is intended for all of our well-beings to inform our play so that we can put it in our back pocket and ask ourselves as we work our way through, starting on Tuesday, the 3rd, the 2nd?
The 3rd.
Thank you very much. We can begin to apply some of that, not just to the 3 people who are Galileo, and not just to Maria, who is his daughter, and not just to the divine leader who was actually Pope Urban VIII, am I correct there?
7th.
7th, thank you very much. I was off by 1. But to everyone in this play. One last bit of information as before Christian takes the floor, however. We need to remember who the play is for. Our target audience are young. And this will probably be the first that they've heard about this guy named Galileo. But, quite frankly, there will be lots of moms and dads who have heard of him but don't have a clue about what he's about. And so although part of what we do as theater types is to inform, part of what we also do is to entertain. And to make sure that they don't miss the big picture, which we'll talk a little bit about before I let you go this evening as well. Because the big picture is as important as some of the smaller pieces that get us there. Our expert on Galileo, Christian Carvajal. Did I say that correctly?
Thank you, Brian. Hi, everybody. Call me Carv. History was not my favorite class in high school because I didn't have great history teachers. I didn't find out till later that history is really the Latin word for story. And if you can tell history like a story, then maybe you can hook people in. And I will try to do that. This is going to be a little tougher because I got people here from 9 to a multiple of 9. Some of you already know a lot of this stuff. Some of you know nothing about it. It's all good. I'll try and keep everything in a vocabulary that most of us can understand. And if you miss a word here or there, that's kind of okay. Okay? I'll try and make it as fun as I can. A lot of what you need to know about Galileo is in the play. The reason I know a lot about Galileo is one of my favorite classes also was science. I got hooked into astronomy very early. I liked math. I liked it just fine. I liked science. And you can't dig very deep into science before you start hearing about Galileo. A lot of people, including Einstein, think that he pretty much invented the way we do science now and figured out how we should think about stuff and why we should care. So when I was finishing my grad work as a directing student, I decided I was going to direct that Brecht play. Brecht was a German playwright of about 90 years ago, a little less, who wrote a play about Galileo, and about Galileo had squared off against the spiritual leaders of his time. And so I wound up doing a year of research on Galileo. One thing I figured out very quickly is that if you look at any year, let's say 1610, which was a big year in Galileo's life, and you talked about this the other day. Well, a year is a year long. And just like this year, a lot of stuff happens in that year. So even though your history book may not even mention that year at all, when you look at it, you find out that it's a very busy time. A lot of things are happening. 1610 also happens to be the time, as you said, when Shakespeare is at the height of his powers. He's writing the best plays ever in the English language. It's an exciting time in Europe because the Renaissance is happening. Now, Renaissance is basically a French word that means rebirth. You're born again. And here's what that means. For 1,500 years, pretty much nothing had been invented. People knew about farming, they knew about some simple machines, they knew how to make bread, they knew a lot of useful things. But basically, the life you led was exactly like the life your grandparents led. And in fact, your grandchildren were going to live pretty much exactly the same life. Right about this time is when the Renaissance happens, and what that means is people begin to learn things again. They begin to learn new things. And the world gets more interesting and more complicated and more challenging and more exciting and more fun. And our place in that world looks a little different. In fancy college talk, we call that a paradigm shift. And it means that your kid's life will not be the same as yours. Things are going to change. It's like a horizon you can't quite see over. And that scares some people. So a lot of what's happening now is not only exciting to people, but also very scary. There's a big argument going on at the time. Think of it like global warming. The reason I bring that up is this. It's very easy when we say, oh, Galileo, he lived in 1600, 1610. That's ancient history. That has nothing to do with my life. It's boring. Yawn. Well, yes, that's kind of true. He lived 400 years ago. And pretty much anything before Netflix and Facebook is a wash, right? You know? Okay? So I get it. Yeah, absolutely. Boring. Who cares? Well, people haven't changed. That's what's the same. People have not changed. Their psychology hasn't changed. The way they experience the world hasn't changed. So when a new discovery comes along, especially a discovery that changes the way you feel about yourself or the way you're going to have to do things in the future, people put up a lot of resistance to that. There's a lot of fight. In our time, it's evolution or global warming or take your pick. In his time, it was this argument about how the solar system worked. You say, who cares? We'll get to that. All right. Amanda, stand up, please. You're recording. Okay, we'll use... What's your name?
Wendy.
Wendy, stand up, please.
Yay.
Rich, stand up, please.
Yay.
Come on out here. Rich, you're the earth. Wendy, right? You're the sun. Okay? One of two things is true. Either the sun goes around the earth. Now, if that's true, Rich, what are you seeing? You're not seeing her behind you.
No,
You're seeing this half circle.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Okay, so that's one possibility. That's actually what it looks like, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the sun comes up, it goes
Sun
overhead,
goes down.
the sun goes down. This way. I just spun the earth the wrong way. This way, okay? Or, yeah, Superman did it, now me.
Right.
All right.
Not scared.
Now you're going to go around the sun. What does it look like? It looks exactly the same, doesn't it?
Right.
She seems to change position in the sky. But here's the difference. If you're moving, surely everybody standing on you falls over. Right? I mean, it's like standing on the bed of a pickup truck, right?
Yeah.
Keep in mind, nobody knows about gravity yet. Nobody knows you're stuck to this thing. All right? That's a big argument. Thank you, folks. Thank you. All right. Which way does the solar system work? Well, since they're both possible, we're going to have to think about, now put yourself in the shoes of somebody living in like 1580. You don't know. There's no satellites, there's no rocket ships. You can't even get in a plane and go up over so where you can see the horizon farther. There's not even really skyscrapers you can stand on. So since it could be either one, and you're Galileo, you're a scientist, you're a thinker, you're trying to figure this out, how do you go at it? Well, this goes to a big topic that I call, how do we know stuff? Okay? How do we know stuff, in my opinion, is the whole point of science, and it's a lot of the point of this play. How do we know stuff? People are going to tell you stuff your whole life. Trust me, kids, we adults, we're dealing with this right now on Facebook and on the news. People tell us stuff, we don't know how to know if it's true or not. It's still a big problem, okay? And it is going to inform Galileo's whole life. Because he's going to figure out a new way to know stuff. All right. I have to apologize at this point because I might possibly step on a toe or two. This isn't something that often happens at OFT. I have to talk about religion. This play does a pretty good job of kind of dancing around the subject and not using words like minister or priest or church. But that's really who Galileo is up against. Now, Galileo is a Catholic, which is good, because so's everybody else. Okay? Galileo, and we know this from private letters from his daughter who was a nun, Galileo was a very staunch Catholic. He believed it with all his heart. And he didn't think he was going to have a problem, but he did. Here's why, okay? How do we know stuff? Well, what's the first way? Somebody we trust tells us. Mom and Dad tell us there's a Santa Claus. Church tells you stuff. Teachers tell you stuff. That weird guy who stands by the post office tells you stuff. Things come in the mail. People send you letters. They tell you stuff. And then you have to decide, do I trust that person to know what they're talking about? That's the way we all start. Everything we start with is stuff somebody told us. Then, we get a few years under our belt, it becomes observation. Not just with our eyes, but with all our senses. Okay? I can look around. When I wake up in the morning, the sun is over there, and it goes over my head, and it goes over there. That kind of goes to the idea that maybe it's going around me. The sun is going around me. And I'm not motion sick, I'm not about to barf, so I must be standing still. Well, here's the problem with that. Sometimes, it turns out, your senses can fib. There's optical illusions, there's all kinds of ways of faking you out using your own senses. But this is at a time when science basically means observing the world. Looking around, looking real close, standing back, getting a good look at it, looking real close again, and writing down what you see. And that's one way to know stuff. It's a pretty good way. It gets most people most of the way through their life. Then, there's reading it in a book. That one's a little tricky because you have to know how to read. Or at least have somebody who can read it to you. In Galileo's time, we're starting to get to a time where all of a sudden most people can read. That hadn't always been true. People can read it in a book. All right. But Joe Schmo down the street writes a book. I never thought he was that bright. Maybe I don't pay attention to his book. There's two sources, two sets of books that people take very seriously in Galileo's time. One is the Bible, obvs, right? Of course, the Bible, why not? And then there's the Greeks. Remember I said the Renaissance means we're starting to learn stuff? Well, the last people who really knew stuff and learned stuff that Europe knew about anyway were the Greeks, from Greece, in Europe. And everybody looked back on them with a lot of respect. The ancient Greek philosophers, the Greek mathematicians who basically invented algebra and geometry and all that stuff you hate, okay? All came from the Greeks. And one in particular they really looked up to. His name was Aristotle. However young you are, you've probably heard of Aristotle. The people in Italy especially during this time period thought that Aristotle was a close second to the Bible. If Aristotle said it and it didn't directly argue with something in the Bible, we're just going to go ahead and assume it's true. He was that smart. Okay? And he really was. He was a bright guy. Given what he had to work with, he did amazing things. Two things you need to know about that. One, the Bible says the earth doesn't move. It says it in like 3 places. Maybe it's a metaphor. Maybe it's just a turn of phrase. Maybe it's science. Who knows? We trust the Bible. The Bible says the earth doesn't move. Good. There's also a story in the book of Judges, I believe, where one of the Hebrew kings is winning a battle, and it's going great, but the sun is about to go down. And so this guy prays to God and says, could you please make the sun stop going down so I'll have enough light to see by and I can finish this battle and whoop these guys? And God says, because it's you. Sure. Boink, there, stuck. And it stays there until he finishes the battle, does what he's got to do, and then the sun finishes going down. Well, if you think the Bible is the be-all, end-all, and the absolute authority on everything, what does that tell you? You've got 2 possibilities. This is the one the Bible says, and guess what? Aristotle doesn't argue with any of this. Very clear. If that's how you learn stuff, you now know that You stand in the middle, and the sun goes around you. And they'd also figured out that the planets seem to go around you. And the stars, and the Milky Way, and everything else seems to go around you. The weather, hey, that actually makes me kind of important. I'm kind of a big deal. Because I'm right here, and by the way, not at the absolute center. Hell was below me. I'm sort of in the next thing up. But then everything is up there. The Bible says that God put all that stuff there to be signs. And so that we could see at night. Moon goes overhead. The moon, they thought the moon was a lamp, basically. A perfectly smooth lamp. Aristotle and other philosophers believed that everything up there must be perfect. So everything had to be perfectly smooth. Beautiful. And it's all on little invisible tracks. And it all goes past us like we're in a railway station. Beautiful. It makes us more important. That makes people feel good. Alright? So if you tell them it's anything different from that, you have now told them that someplace else is the important place, and you're just one of those trains passing in the night. That doesn't feel very good. Okay? Now, there's another way of learning stuff. We could think about it really hard. We could use logic. Logic and math are kind of the same thing. Math is a way of writing logic. If I start with things we all agree on, and I go through my sets and steps, and I get over here, and nobody can find a problem with my logic or my math, this must be true. Beautiful. That was the Greek way of learning stuff. And Galileo knew it very well. He was good at math. He was good at logic. He understood that if I get from something we can all agree on to here, and nobody can find a problem with my steps, this has to be true. Well, that's science. That's good. And he's going to rely on it. Okay? Now, this is the boring part. And I apologize for it in advance. I want to give you just a quick review of the life of Galileo, and I'll stop here and there just to tell you things that are important to him. A lot of it, again, is in the play. He's born in 1564. He's born in Pisa. Leaning Tower of Pisa, everybody knows what that is? Well, Pisa is the town that Leaning Tower is in. Okay? It's near Florence. In fact, it's in the country of Florence at that point, because Italy used to be a lot of little duchies and kingdoms and, vacant lots. Italy being one country is actually fairly recent. They all decided to come together within the last few centuries. So he actually lives in the country, the Duchy of Florence. In 1581, remember the story in the play about how he notices that no matter how long the pendulum is, it swings in exactly the same amount of time? Well, he noticed that in 1581. He was in his 30s. It was kind of his first big observation. It's weird that no one had noticed that before, but he thought, this has got to mean something. 1588, he gets a teaching job in Florence. Now, Florence at this point is a rich city. In fact, it's a city of art. It still is. If your parents or whoever ever get to send you to Florence, you got to go. It's a beautiful city, great museums. It's where all the good art is. Okay? So he's surrounded by smart, rich people. That's handy. In fact, it's so handy that 7 years later, he gets his first teaching job in Florence. And he begins to show his students that if you drop a bowling ball and a baseball, they hit the ground at the same time. That doesn't sound right. But try it at home. Anybody can try it. That's the beauty of science. You don't have to take my word for it. You can go try it. You know who didn't think that happened? Aristotle. Aristotle had said very clearly that the heavier thing will hit the ground first, obviously, because it's heavier. Remember, they don't know about gravity. They don't know how any of that works. So now Galileo is telling his students, at still a fairly young age, that guy that you think is the master brainiac of all time, I'm smarter than he is. And now you are too. Now you know something that he doesn't. That's going to be trouble. Okay? A year later, 1589, he's the chair of the math department in Pisa. Kind of a big deal. But 3 years after that, he gets an upgrade. He gets to go to Padua, which is near Venice, an even richer city. Lots of smart people running around. It's kind of the New York City of its time. Everything's buzz. Everything's go. Such a big deal that Shakespeare wrote about it like it was the big city. Okay? You can still go to the University of Padua. It's still open. They're very proud that Galileo taught there. It's a great place to teach, and he was there for a long time. 1600, his daughter Virginia is born. That's his firstborn. He also has 2 other children, Livia, a year later, Vincenzo, 5 years after that. Here's a fun fact. He wasn't married any of those 3 times. A devout Catholic at a time when people said, boys will be boys. What are you going to do? Okay? But that's still bad news for the daughter, so she has to go off and be a nun. Not a bad life. It's kind of like going off and being a college student at the time. Colleges, truly, because colleges were, convents were where a lot of the learning happened. Places of worship. If you didn't want to, clean floors your whole life, and you probably couldn't get a rich husband because of the whole don't know where mom is thing, then a convent is actually a nunnery, right, in Shakespeare's time. It's actually a pretty great place to be. You get to be around other smart people. You don't get to talk that much, but, when you do, you'll have something fun to talk about. So off she goes. She goes to the nunnery. All right. 1609, Galileo buys his first telescope. Contrary to the play, he didn't name it. For a long time, people's science textbooks in school and history textbooks said he invented the thing. He did not. They invented it in Holland, what we now call the Netherlands, where the Dutch live, and he bought one. And it was like a fun party trick, right? Like a Viewmaster, or I don't know, what would something from the 21st century? Like Olympia, like a Slinky or something, like a fun little science toy. Now, somebody gives you a pair of binoculars, your first pair of binoculars or something, you use it to look around, right? Maybe, whatever. You're looking at people's houses, you're looking at the freeway, you're looking at stuff. Galileo and some other people do something very interesting with it. They look up. Now, what are they looking at? We know how all that works. What are you looking for? Well, he just thinks maybe I'll see something through this that I couldn't see with my naked eye. And he does. 1610, he's looking through the telescope and he's looking at the planet Jupiter, which was then and still is the biggest planet in our solar system. Galileo doesn't know that. He just knows he can see it extra clearly because it's big. And he notices this weird thing. There are these stars, these 3 or 4 stars right next to it. And he makes a little drawing of it. When he looks again the next night, they've all moved. They're in a different order. Next night he looks again. One of them is gone. He looks again a few nights later. Now there's more. He can't figure this out. He thinks about it and he thinks about it. The only thing it could possibly be is that those stars are little tiny planets that are going around the big planet. We would call that a moon. A little planet that goes around our big planet, we call the moon. Well, Jupiter's got a bunch of them, but he can only see 4. You know why that's a problem? Because everything's supposed to be on a train track. How did this one get past Jupiter to be over there? There's no bypass. If everything's on a track and going around me, how's that work? They must be going around Jupiter as it goes around us. That's big news. In fact, it's very controversial. It's so scary that he thinks a long time before he decides to tell anybody about it, like weeks. Here's the thing about scientists. They're geeks. They're nerds. They get really excited about this stuff. And he can't wait to tell people. Okay? So he puts out a book. And that book is called Sidereus Nuncius. That's in Latin. At this point, even though everybody spoke Italian, they spoke Latin when they were trying to be fancy and sound smart. Some people still do. Okay? So if you wanted to talk to other scientists, you talk in Latin. That's why the first part of this play, when you're in the classroom and it's fricadus, fracadus, all that stuff, it's making fun of Latin. Because that's what Latin sounds like. Okay? So these students are in a classroom learning from Galileo in Latin, and they're learning how to speak Latin so they can read all the latest books. All right. So he puts out a book with a Latin title, Sidereus Nuncius. In English, that can mean one of 2 things. It can either, Sidereus means having to do with stars, and Nuncius either means a messenger, or, depending on how you look at it, the message itself. Well, the first time it was translated in English, somebody said Starry Messenger. And that's what we call it now. We often call that book Starry Messenger. But it's very likely that it actually meant message about stars. And it was. It was a big message about stars. It was a message that sometimes little stars go around big stars in its own little circle, in its own little path. That's crazy. He had also noticed something else. When he looked at the moon, you remember there's a song that has something about, I can see holes in the moon? Well, everybody else looked at the moon and they saw the man in the moon, right? They saw designs on the moon. Still a great lantern, still nice and smooth and flat and glowing, but it had had dark patches on it. Well, when he looked closer through his telescope now, he could see better. Try it with binoculars. Go look at the moon. If you watch it long enough, you'll notice that on one side of a crater, the sun will suddenly hit the edge of the crater. And then it'll travel down, and then all of a sudden, the whole thing is lit, and then maybe the shadow starts, and it does that. But it doesn't all, as the shadow goes around it, it doesn't all light up at the same time. And he thought, well, what made that happen? How's that work? There's only one thing it could be. Now, Galileo had art training, and he knew that sometimes paintings have rough surfaces. If you stand back from like a Van Gogh painting, it just looks like it does in a book. But if you walk up to it, you can actually stand to the side of it, and you can see that it has a terrain. I thought, well, that's what I'm seeing. The moon is rough. The moon is a rough surface. It has a terrain. It's not perfect. How did those holes get in it? I've never seen anything make a hole in the moon. It must have happened a long time ago. He begins to ask big questions about the moon that, again, are arguing with what everybody else thinks. Okay? Now, 1613, he notices that there are little spots that go around the sun. And he stares at them for hours through the telescope. That was a dumb decision. Smart people can do dumb things. That one will catch up with him later. In 16... Now understand at this point, much more than now, the church, meaning the Catholic Church, and government, meaning the king or whoever, they're like this. Okay? Which means that if you annoy somebody in your church, they can send you to court. They can send you to jail. Specifically, they can send you to a court called the Inquisition. Famously scary. You didn't want to go talk to them. It made talking to the principal look like a day at Disneyland. Okay? Well, guess what? In 1616, the Inquisition puts out a message to all of the neighborhood that says, you don't get to say anymore that the earth goes around the sun. It's only the other way. You don't, we're done. We're done with this. There's no global warming. We've had it. Okay? We're not going to do that thing anymore. Okay. Everybody heard that. That was Pope Paul V who said that. 1623, though, Galileo gets a break because he wants to tell everybody it's the other way around. He gets a break. Cardinal Barberini, who is a friend of his high up in the church, the previous pope dies, and just like happens now in the Catholic Church, they all get together and they elect a new guy. Okay? And they elect a guy named Cardinal Barberini, and they make him Pope Urban VII. Big break! Because it turns out Galileo and this cardinal were buddies. They knew each other. They went way back. So Galileo thinks, now that my buddy's in charge, I can say whatever I want, and they'll stay off my case. Yes and no. All right? They give him a little rope. They let him go. And in 1632, he sends out another book called The Dialogue About the Two Major World Systems. Okay? It's written like a play script. Somebody had told him, Galileo, if you want to talk about these ideas, keep in mind it's totally banned. But you can do it if you write it as a play and you just have people debating it. And okay? No big deal. You can do that. I mean, watch your P's and Q's. But you can do that. So Galileo does. And once again, this very smart guy does something really stupid. He has three characters in his play. Two of them are named after his friends. Those two guys, one guy thinks just like Galileo does, that the earth goes around the sun. Another guy, he doesn't know what to think. He's just there to listen. He throws in little jokes and comments every now and again. The other guy thinks what the Pope thinks, which is that the earth is the center and everybody goes around that. Galileo gives that character a name. He calls him Simplicio.
Oh boy.
To an Italian of the time, just like now, that sounds a lot like simple-minded. Basically, funny joke, he tells everybody that the Pope is kind of a dum-dum for thinking all this other stuff. You're not going to believe this, but that does not go over well. Okay? Keep in mind, that's 1632. In 1633, guess what happens to Galileo? He gets called on the carpet. Get your backside over here. He gets called in for a trial. The trial does not go well. You will still hear some history books say that Galileo kind of sassed the court. He didn't. I promise you he did not. We do know that to scare him, they didn't torture him. They could have. They tortured a lot of people. There was no innocent until proven guilty. There was guilty until you admit it.
Right.
Okay? Whole different way of looking at the world, not a great one. Apparently, all they did is they said, Galileo, come here, before you make your plea. This is what we're going to do to you if you don't admit you were wrong. We've got this machine, it pulls your thumbs, this one, it's the rack, this one, I don't even know what that one does, so I can't even look at it. He takes one look at these things, turns white as a sheet, and guess what? You're under house arrest, and you are absolutely banned under any circumstances, now or ever for the rest of your life, of talking about this stuff ever again. I got you, I'm good, I got it, just let me, okay. So off he goes, and it's not that bad. He has a little country place in a town called Arcetri, which again is near Florence, which means cool people can come visit him. He got off pretty light, given the circumstances. Given that his books are kind of bestsellers, he's doing just fine. 1638, 5 years later, he can't help himself. This very smart guy does a dumb thing, and he writes a book called Two New Sciences. There are no new sciences. We already told you that. We call them in science, we call them the discorsi, meaning the lectures. Okay? Well, he is smart enough to know he can't have them published in Italy, so he has them published in Holland. But they get out, and guess how he writes it? It's a play with those same three dudes. His buddy, himself, basically, under an obvious pen name, and Simplicio shows up again to be the dum-dum. That was also the year, remember I talked about those sunspots? He's staring at the sun through the telescope. You know, they tell you not to do that, right? Here's why. He goes blind as a bat. Without the sonar. Okay? So here's this poor old guy under house arrest now. He just can't help himself. He's a geek. Whatever you love, imagine somebody told you you could never talk about that the rest of your life. He can't do it. He just can't. He can't help himself. So here's this guy sending, the guy from essentially the grocery store comes with his stuff. He goes, would you take this book out of here? Yeah, sure. And it gets smuggled out. It gets smuggled out of the country. 1642, Galileo dies. Interesting, fun times. Nobody can figure out where to bury him because he wasn't in good with the church. So they move him around from one place to another. They actually chop little bits of him off as keepsakes. It's a thing they did.
Wow.
So, for example, there's a Galileo museum in Florence. And you can go there, and I'm not going to demonstrate what I mean, but you can see Galileo's upraised middle finger under a glass jar like in Beauty and the Beast. Didn't mean the same thing to the Italians it means to us, but it kind of did. Okay? You can go to the museum and you can get Flip the Bird by Galileo. It's pretty cool. And by the way, the finger is in amazingly good shape, given that it's been 400 years. All right. Remember I talked about how we know stuff? This is sort of the big finish. Galileo, in this play, it talks a lot about how Galileo said, look, just because somebody told you something, or you read it in a book, no matter how respected that book is, no matter how much we all love that book, I like books too, it could be wrong. In fact, even your eyes can fool you. But there's a new way of learning stuff. We can make machines that let me see farther than I could with my own eyes, or see smaller things Galileo also worked with microscopes, which he also didn't invent, but he started looking at things. Now, we're in a time before anybody knows anything. Basically, I've got a timeline here. We didn't know until Galileo's lifetime that blood goes around the body. That was something we figured out while he was alive. Things are made of cells. Galileo had been dead almost 20 years when we figured that out. Isaac Newton discovered gravity, basically. It was hard to miss, it seems to me, if you drop something. But he noticed that it applied to everything, and they all fell at the same speed. He also, Newton also noticed that if light passed through a piece of glass shaped just the right way, it would split into a rainbow, which means although light looks like it's clear, it's really made of different colors. What? Which gave us Pink Floyd album covers and a lot of important things.
That's important.
It is important. 1751, Galileo has been dead for over 100 years. We find out that lightning is made of electricity. Before that, nobody knew what it was. The gods got mad at you? Zot! There, you're done.
Right.
It's a bolt, like an arrow. I'm firing a bolt from my bow. That's what they thought a lightning bolt was. It was an arrow from the gods. They had no idea, and it didn't stick around for them to look at it, so they didn't know. Chemistry basically got invented until the late 1700s. So we don't know anything. A lot of things that we know now, like the planet Neptune, nobody had ever seen. We didn't find by looking at them. We can't see that far. We found by looking through a tube with lenses, a machine. It's a simple machine, really, but it lets me see farther than I can see. And it lets me settle some of these big questions. Okay? Why was that question of what goes around what important? Because it changes how important we are. And if the sun is the center, and we're going around that, and forget that, we've learned since then that the sun is going around something else, and that's going around something else, we're tiny, tiny, tiny. And the universe isn't as young as we thought it was. It goes back billions of years. We didn't know. We get smaller and smaller and smaller, and that doesn't make us feel good. It changes what we have to do to make ourselves feel good about ourselves. So, since you don't want that to be true, there's an interesting scene in this play and in Brecht's, where the great leaders come to look at the telescope, and Galileo says, if you will just look through this, I've got it aimed at the moon, let's say, you will see that I'm right. You can see it happening. And they don't look through the telescope. They go, I don't look through that. No. Is it just because they're stubborn? Is it because they're stupid? No. No. It's real easy to think that. It's real easy to think that they're just dumb. That's not why they didn't look. They didn't look because no one had ever used machines to see better before. There's no TV, there's no Facebook, there's no nothing. There's no radio. So if that tube says that the moon isn't perfectly smooth, and Aristotle says it is, the tube is lying. In fact, it might be possessed. Because that's very real to them. There are demons, invisible demons in the air all around. I don't know about you, but I was raised in a church like that too. They're everywhere trying to make bad things happen to you. If you believe in that, I'm not saying they're there, I'm not saying they're not there. But if you believe in that and you don't believe in machines, it makes perfect sense to think that the devil has put a whim-wham on that tube to show you things that aren't there. So we have a new way of knowing things. We all take it for granted. I can look on my phone, and if it tells me there's a traffic jam ahead, what do? I pay attention to it. I didn't see it. I didn't hear the traffic jam. Nobody called me to tell me it was there, but my machine says it's there. We were driving here. The radio said there was a traffic pileup just before our exit to get into Olympia, and we believed it. We began to slide over lanes and make plans. Well, guess what? It was actually on the other side of the exit. They got that wrong. But we take for granted when machines tell us things. If Facebook tells me my friend is talking to me from Oklahoma, I don't believe Facebook is lying to me. I believe my friend really typed that. They don't. And they have no reason to. So this is all brand new. Why is this important? Because by looking through these things and by using machines that extend what we can learn, our whole view of where we are in the universe and how big it is and how old it is and how important we are and how much God loves us. He put all those stars there in a pretty pattern just for us to look at. Not exactly. They were there billions of years before us. In fact, we now know that the light that's coming from them took so long to get here that they don't even look like that anymore. That's all stuff we're seeing like a time machine, right? Galileo, in order to make his points, gave us a new way to know stuff. And Europe and scientists and everybody else, inventors, artists, writers, took that and ran with it. And now most of what we know through machines. And it's something we've been playing with for the last 400 years. Now, Brian Tyrrell says that this play is about believing in your ideas. And it absolutely is. But I'm going to add one thing to it. Because this was Galileo's whole philosophy on life. Believe in your ideas if you can prove them. That's the difference. I can believe whatever I want. I can believe I'm going to walk out the door and trip over a bag of money. I'd better see some documentation on that. Okay? Make sure you have proof for what you believe. And it could be any of those things. It could be, look, it's right there. Observation. I suppose it could be, well, Grandma told me. And if we all think your grandma is brilliant, maybe that'll be enough. But the bigger the claim you make, Carl Sagan, one of my heroes, used to say this, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If I tell you that somebody had the flu and got better, I'll probably just take your word for it. If you tell me somebody got dead and then got better, I'm going to need some proof. And that, again, is a new idea in this time. It's not enough just for somebody to tell you or because it's in a book. You're going to need proof. That's why Galileo is important. That's why everything we do in our lives still depends on him. Look, if it hadn't been him, it would have been somebody. Somebody would have come along 50 years later and done the same thing. But it wasn't them. It was this interesting, overweight guy with a weird family who liked to live close to the action and who got in arguments sometimes, and he couldn't help himself. He was kind of like an obnoxious blogger. He just couldn't resist. He couldn't resist. Something fascinated him. I just discovered Supernatural. It's amazing. Okay. No, it's not. Supernatural is terrible. Yeah, but it's kind of awesome. Okay. That's who Galileo is. And one thing I've tried to do in my performance, and I encourage everybody to do the same, is try and remember, no matter how much you love or hate science in school, these people love it. They love it so much. It's the thing they geek about all the time with their friends and their loved ones. His daughter, Galileo and his daughter, wrote letters back and forth for the rest of their lives about science. When you become a nun, you change your name. She named herself Maria. She was born in Virginia, after Virgin Mary, right? She named herself Virgin Mary, Maria Celeste. Celeste is Italian for the sky. And a lot of people think that was a tribute to her dad. She loved both. She loved the stuff she had learned and the stuff they were learning now. It's important. So try and remember to geek out a little bit. It'll make the play a lot more fun for everybody.